Welcome to the Intrazone, a show about the Microsoft 365 Intelligent Intranet. I'm Mark Cashman, here with my co-host, Chris, who's just past launching Topics McNulty.
Well, thanks, Mark. Today, we're talking with Dux Raymond Sy from AvePoint and Stephanie Donahue from PAIT Group, both longstanding members of our MVP community and Microsoft regional directors. We want to talk about productivity and how people can adopt Microsoft Teams.
Out in the community, both Dux and Stephanie, along with Mark Rackley, were putting out a lot of great content that was specific about the best practices for deploying Microsoft Teams at scale. So a very focused conversation, and their workshops were oriented around the enterprise, but we thought there was a lot of merit around what is the value of Microsoft Teams, how you deploy it at scale, their best practices and learnings that they were willing to share that gets into sort of the core of what you would always want to put in place, a good way to have the balance of the end user benefits and good user experience backed with something that can be supported by IT from a governance and a content services perspective. So we thought it was the best of both worlds. There's a lot of energy around Teams, and there's a lot of guidance that Dux and Stephanie were putting out there. Chris, when you start to think about deploying Teams, we know there's a lot behind it, but what would you say is kind of the first thing you would target in a conversation? Hey, we're thinking about Teams. What do we do?
Well, Teams, we describe it as the hub for teamwork. Analyst firms like Gartner talk about solutions like Teams as being your digital nucleus. It's a fairly large nucleus. And so there's lots of things that Teams does and lots of ways to approach it. What I'm interested in hearing from Stephanie and Dux about are what are some of those paths to that, vibrant, energized center of that hub? Because Teams brings in, even just out of the box, you have lists, you have files, you have chat, you have meetings, you have apps. It provides this common superstructure that you can plug all of these different solutions into, some from Microsoft and some from others. It reminds me a little bit of the wheel. You remember the wheel, don't you, Mark?
I remember the wheel, the pie, the lots of things that one Swiss Army knife approach.
Back when I was an MVP and talking about SharePoint adoption, one of the things I would usually put up is the pie or the wheel. For those of you who haven't seen it, it was a circle divided into 6 sections about insights and collaboration and communication and productivity and all these other elements with all the different subsystems of SharePoint. And I said, if you want an adoption disaster, turn all of these on for your users at once and just, let them go nuts. I think Teams is certainly broader than even the old SharePoint wheel was in terms of the kinds of things that it can do.
The potential is there to be broader, to the extent of beyond the normal 6 slices of that pie or circle, because similar to how I think SharePoint evolved, from the get-go, Teams took this approach of being both an application for end users and a platform for, obviously, IT, but think of it in terms of also a platform for content distribution, a way to bring together content and collaboration. And I think with that, at least what I hope that Dux and Stephanie have spent a lot of time thinking that they'll share is how do you make that a great first run experience, and that there may be steps to go from a pilot or an early rollout phase to something that is broad adoption and use for the appropriateness of each customer. What are you really wanting to get out of it? But I think, you listed off files, tasks, chats, meetings. That already is 4 out of 6 things that maybe we can equate to if you think of the SharePoint history. But there's, of course, a lot more, and it's both for first-party and third-party applications to plug into. So there's a lot to consider, and there's a lot of things to be mindful for end users. And, of course, from an IT perspective, to have plans put in place on how you plan to use the tool. I think of the past of SharePoint as kind of being a predictive model for how to do it best, and take into consideration of what this tool is really good at and can be molded and mended for what it needs to be. But Chris, if you put on your consultant hat from the past in the SharePoint and you said, SharePoint can do a lot, tell me what you want out of it. Is that a same approach you would want to take, with Teams, knowing that it does a lot, but let's make it do the right things for you?
Yeah. And, I would say that if you're at a theoretical 5,000 person company, I think you are far better off getting deeply penetrated usage of one thing, say meetings, to everyone in the company and using that to start building across rather than trying to drive everything at the get-go to a small group of people, because Teams has a network effect. And I'm not just talking about its signaling logic. I mean, the more people are in it, the more benefit there is. And if only one department of your company is using Teams, well, then it becomes harder to schedule meetings with them or harder to raise them on chat. Whereas if people are making a habit of, I go to Teams on my desktop and Teams on my mobile for meetings, great. And because from that, you can start building over to like, well, meetings have chat and get that viral adoption. And and I can paste a file into the chat. That's great. But I need to track more data. Well, now we can bring lists in. I think you can move in multiple directions, but I think it's better to drive one thing to completion than to drive everything across the board. I also, Mark, have to help our audience out on a little bit of the sci-fi production wizardry that our crack engineering team does. I think you know what I'm talking about.
I think so. And I want to have, some button that I push on my shirt that, beams me up or something like that. But maybe be a little bit more explicit.
We're jumping around in time, Mark and I. And so when we record with Stephanie and Dux, we're going to be in early January of 2021. But I'm now coming to you today later on in 2021. And we have already released Microsoft Viva. I can see into the future and know that it's coming. And so that's another place where we're bringing 4 additional modules, insight, learning, connections, and topics as potential elements for Teams. It's much easier to introduce those if people already have that Teams habit than if you have a new capability and you're trying to roll it out to people who don't have that Teams foundation already deployed.
So you're saying let's take the time machine, go backwards to bring us into the future.
Yes, Marty McFly. That's, I think, exactly what I'm saying. So why don't we press pause on our chat here and get ready to bring Dux and Stephanie here into our IntraZone virtual studio.
Welcome to the IntraZone. This is a live IntraZone at the Microsoft 365 Collaboration Conference. And we're grabbing this time Stephanie Donahue and Dux Raymond Sy. Stephanie comes to us from the PAIT Group. Dux is coming from AvePoint. And their combined specialty, at least on this particular episode of the IntraZone, is Teams adoption.
Well, hello, everybody. Stephanie Donahue. I am a regional director, Microsoft Regional Director and MVP. I co-founded and I'm the CEO at the PAIT Group. We do Microsoft 365 consulting focused around the collaboration tools. So we work with Microsoft Teams and SharePoint, the Power Platform every day. And me personally, my job is now split kind of in two. I spend about half my time on management strategy for PAIT, and I spend most of my time with our customers, helping them figure out what to do with their Microsoft 365 investment and hoping that they get the most value out of it.
Excellent.
So my name is Dux. Pleasure to be here. Great to meet everybody. I serve as a Chief Brand Officer at AvePoint, and AvePoint has been around for the last 19 years. We help manage customers' data in Microsoft 365. We help move it to Microsoft 365, manage it, and protect it. So grateful for being in this community in the last 18 years or so. Just like Stephanie, I serve as a Microsoft Regional Director and MVP as well, and excited to be here to talk about Teams adoption.
Thank you both for being here. Thanks for being on the IntraZone. So I think first question that I have, and I think a lot of customers have, when they're looking at putting this plan together, they've heard about this thing, Teams, they've started to use it. What do you really talk about from a strategy perspective? Stephanie, what are some of the things that you think of when you think strategically? How do you really ground what it is that people should know about Microsoft Teams adoption?
Well, when we first start working with a customer and we're trying to figure out their specific strategy, because there's really no wrong way to roll out, right? What we're trying to do is focus in on what are their pain points? What are the things that are really hitting the organization hard? And then we map those things to what Microsoft Teams can do best. So, what we love to see is that bigger strategy when they're saying, yeah, we're committing not just to Teams, but that bigger 365 platform. And then we can start picking off some of those, miscellaneous applications and really pulling everything into one, kind of under one umbrella. So that's what we go looking for first, like how are they working and how do we pull that into this really great Teams application and make it a great experience for them?
Would you say that people are coming at the conversation and they're painting their vision of the digital modern workplace? And I'm using some of your words from your workshop. Or is it kind of the reverse where they're doing a bunch of things and they haven't really maybe coalesced the real approach that will help them in the end?
Yeah, I think it's really more of the latter. I think everybody sort of generally knows what they want from a high level perspective. They know they need to work remote. They know they need to collaborate better together. But they generally, when we start to work with customers, they feel kind of scattered. I'm going a bunch of places for different things, and I really just need to help getting organized.
And when they get organized, or they obviously put a strategy together, knowing that that is one of the goals. Dux, on your side, there's probably some of those same upfront conversations. What does that mean for teams, especially in the before we do anything, let's make sure we do X with our governance or put a plan in place? What should they be thinking about?
I think about the last 8 months, right? The reality is, in an ideal world, we plan, we organize before we roll up. In the last 8 months, we've seen a lot of organizations deploy Teams sooner than they would have wanted. And most of the use cases around Teams is around calling and chats, which is great, right? So because people are remote, they need a way to communicate and really have that experience like Skype or Zoom. Hence, that's what's typically the first workload that Teams are being used for. The beauty of this is that as organizations starts using Teams for that, then now they look at, okay, we realize that Teams can do more, as Stephanie mentioned. And one of the key exercise or conversations we have with organizations large or small is, okay, now that you've seen the potential of Teams, with great power comes great responsibility. So the question becomes, sure, we can come up with governance, we can come up with all the rules, what to do, not to do when you create a Teams. Make sure you don't create private channels or don't change permission in SharePoint. But that's too much for people to handle. They won't remember all of that. Not everybody's working in IT. So the question now becomes, how do you make it easy for people to do the right thing? And the good news is there's tons of basic things you can do out of the box. You can write PowerShell, but that's where the governance conversation begins. It's not really about, hey, you need this big governance document and all the rules, but more around how do you make it easy for people to do the right thing in 3 core areas, especially around collaboration. How do you make it easy for people to create and use Teams? So in the area of provisioning, can anybody and everybody self-provision or self-create Teams or not? And it's not like an all or nothing as well, right? It's not just IT can do it. So there's that conversation. The second conversation is, how do you make it easy for people to manage the team that they're using, especially if they're Teams owner? What if people start changing SharePoint permissions that's different than Teams, or creating subsites in that SharePoint site collection? How do you make it easy for them not to do that and make it easy for them to do the right thing? And then the third layer that we talk about around governance is, how do you make it easy for them to do the right thing around information lifecycle? What happens to the team once it's not being used anymore? Does it just sit there? Does it have to go through some kinds of record management process because you're bounded by Sarbanes-Oxley compliance that you can't get rid of stuff for 7 years? So those are some of the key conversations we have, especially with IT, to set it up that it's easy for people to do the right thing.
So if you've got that broader strategy and you say, yep, I'm going to commit to it, and you've dug in and understood that, when I start to share information, documents, people are creating and sharing and maybe then offboarding or offloading, archiving, and that's committed, as part of the plan. Let's change a little bit into then putting it into practice. And I've just listed that next topic of moving from beyond strategy and starting to go from a pilot to full rollout. And I know there's a ton there, so this is kind of a weighted question. First, Stephanie, when you think of how do we then get started right? How do we get our best foot forward and the realities of how you can scale up and assume, X size of customer? It doesn't have to be the biggest or the smallest, but just what would be those common steps and some best practices to think about in the getting started phase?
Yeah, so hopefully as you get through that planning engagement, you've built excitement. So that's kind of the first thing is like, as you begin to bring people into this world of like doing things a new way and the art of possible in here, hopefully they're getting really excited about what the possibilities are. And then you roll right into those proof of concepts where if you've done discovery well, then you're finding their pain points and you're giving them those hands-on experiences of how do I fix my pain point? And then I get into it right away. I think too often we want this like 1 year or 2 year plan and we want everything to be perfect and we want to push everything out at the same time. And maybe by then they don't even remember that first conversation and they've been so frustrated in the middle, that they don't even like, whatever, what are you pushing out? It's just IT. They just push tech. So that kind of that process of moving quickly from having the conversation, finding the pain points, getting them hands-on really early on, and that kind of helps everything gel, I think, for them. And then as you start to get those examples, making sure that you're getting those users in front of others, because I think a good business user story coming from them and not IT is really what's going to help you with the buy-in with everyone else. Because we really like to focus on, I think it was Reuven who originally said this, but like focus on the green dots, not the red ones. You put a lot of emphasis on those people that are really excited about doing this and really have ideas around what to implement and what they want. And then you take those people and let them speak for you and get everyone else excited. So that's really kind of how you get that momentum going. And I think too often we stop and we have to plan and we wait too long. So just take one step into the next as quickly as you can. Of course, following all of Dux's advice on governance along the way.
That's the thing is, I feel like you are of one brain collectively in this conversation, because of course you're not going to do one or the other. It's really a both. And maybe Dux, just to get your thoughts on the train the trainer, the finding the not just the executive support, but some peer level who's actually going to then help expand and roll it out. Your seat as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about practical approaches, right? So there's multiple stakeholder that's involved, but one key advice I would have is really time box it. So for example, if you want to roll out Teams, it's actually doable in 90 days. There is a model where in 90 days, you can have a full deployment in your organization. And then you break it down into essentially in 30-day buckets, right? So for example, the first month, as Stephanie mentioned, come up with use cases. So what are these use cases? It doesn't have to be pie in the sky. You're hooking up Teams with CRM, SAP, Run DMC. It doesn't have to be that, right? The 3 use cases could be as simple as, hey, we have drivers that's delivering stuff and they're communicating each other through WhatsApp. Well, what about a use case for them where you use the Teams mobile app and similar capability, but then that's how you deliver the training materials or memos and whatnot. And then, or even put in their schedule through the shifts capability. So that's a use case, right? So the first month, come up with like 3 very simple use cases to different business units and target it to them. And at the same time, make sure, as Mark mentioned, bring in leadership to say, hey, okay, month 1, we're doing these 3 things with these pilot groups and let's see what happens. And then as you look at what happens, take your learnings, what worked, what didn't work. In the second month now, have expand the use case and take these use cases like managing projects and then apply it to a broader group. Take all your learnings, and then at the same time, you're now preparing for a broader deployment to the whole organization, which means you're also putting together like FAQ, knowledge base, support processes, and then third month, roll it out to the broader organization. So the point is, real world scenario, sure, you can train them on, how to call in Teams, how to create a channel, but the use case is the key. So when you train people, you don't just teach them how to use the tool, but like, this is how you do it, go do it.
Dux, I really wanted to ask you follow up and then bring Stephanie in on this about what are the best practices you've seen in real adoption? Because in that transition from strategy to practice, frequently the things that you theorized about moving in the comfort of planning sessions don't always work in the real world. How do you make sure you have kind of good listening strategies in place to be able to kind of read and react to adoption realities on the fly?
I can think about a specific customer, right? This is a government customer we work with, and COVID happened. So this is very, very appropriate. Prior to COVID, they're about to deploy teams, and the whole planning strategy, the company's contoso, world will be perfect, but COVID happened, and now they see the necessity of teams, which is great. So now leadership at one point, which then prioritized teams rollout, is now important. What the cool thing is, fine, they rolled out teams for calling and chatting. That's great. But the team that was planning for it, originally they wanted this big, we'll have end user training, we'll have team owner training. But then they started with the use case of work from home. What do people need to do when they work from home other than calling and chatting? Oh, you know what? They have tons of files in their old file share for the different departments that we're going to start moving. And they brought the departments as a part of that process. So they created essentially a team for each department. They moved their content from their old file share. And that was a learning opportunity. We're now stuck. We have to work from home. So how do we make this work? That's how they introduced teams, right? While the original planning phase, where they want this whole proper training and different departments, and that never happened, but they used the work from home scenario to make it relevant. And then they did that in multiple tiers. They did that first, obviously, with IT. And then they're thinking, okay, who are the relevant groups in the business that would take advantage of this? Keep in mind, this is a local government agency in a specific state. And a lot of them that would service the public, right? Like their local social security office and police. So they enable those groups first. So to your question, Chris, is how do you make it happen is what's pressing. Look at what's pressing and use that to use teams to help them.
Stephanie, would love to bring you in on this too. Like, how do you know what to listen for when deciding whether or not to adjust your strategy on the fly?
Well, the one thing we found to be really effective is that they're not going to come to you and say this isn't working, especially early on. We set up regular meetings. How's it going? What are you using? How are you using it? And when you get really specific with those questions, you'll find out things like, oh, well, I tried to do this, but it doesn't work. Well, it actually does work, but there was a misunderstanding, or they didn't know how to use the tool the right way. Or, there's 1,000 reasons that a lot of times people just don't want to admit they don't know, or they're just busy with their work and they're just like, I'll deal with it later. And then they never come back to it. So we find that it's super important to engage early and often as soon as they get in there. And, you can't sit with every user in the organization, but maybe with the stakeholder or the owner of the team, and just really get specific about how things are going. So you have the opportunity to remove barriers and to remove those misunderstandings. And I heard this today. I just needed to hear it in my own context of how I do my job. Those generic training sessions don't always hit home, but maybe they need it. This is how I would do it in my day-to-day process. And sometimes that makes all the difference with the adoption.
It's interesting hearing both of you speak to that. I'm thinking about what Microsoft's learnings kind of have been, especially with the accelerated deployment schedules we've seen because of this pandemic. And I'm thinking specifically about, some of the signals that an organization can use to measure their success coming out of places like workplace analytics or the business continuity dashboard. Like, you're rolling something out, you can actually measure, are people getting more connected? Are people having better quality interactions through the course of their day? And I think it's important to also continuously measure and evaluate what you're doing going on there. I wanted to also pivot over, I'm mentioning some things that may sound, a lot like agile software development philosophies about breaking things down into smaller work units and how you make quick pivots from one sprint to the next to do things. And so kind of thinking a little bit more from a developer and specifically a platform point of view. Teams is a great set of productivity experiences, but it also is that meta OS that lets people plug additional capabilities into Teams beyond the ones that Microsoft has, whether they're ones our customers are building or our partners are building. What advice do you give to customers about the ways to think about plugging even more into Teams beyond what Microsoft supplies? Stephanie, would love to start with you.
There's a lot of things there. And we always say maybe, as you're doing that collection up front on discovery and what people need, sometimes that's not a phase one when you're talking about what else does it do, but making sure to keep note of it, making sure that, especially if it's important, maybe you do need to hit it early on, but understanding what that is and what those systems are. And I feel like there's a couple layers of that, right? There's 365 and what it does. And then there are things like the Q&A bot, which, that kind of gets them outside of 365, but still under the Microsoft stack in Azure and, being able to do more in that space. Something like replacing HR FAQ with a Q&A bot where people can ask into Teams, how do I find my benefits kind of thing. That kind of extends. And once you get that thought process really going, well, what else can I do? What else can I go query? And then that's when you kind of get into, can I connect into my other business systems and how do I work with those and integrate those into 365? So I feel like it's a little bit of a process to get that mindset shift going. But once you start those conversations and they start to see some of that hands-on, and some of that's super simple. I mean, you say bot and people are like, oh, it's complicated. It doesn't have to be that complicated. So once you get those ideas rolling, then you get them outside of that box of what they expect to see. And then they get really creative about what else they can do.
Dux, if we think about this audience, and certainly the Intrazone audience is pretty familiar with SharePoint of the past as a platform, and now with Teams really coming on strong with a lot of platform capabilities, and certainly in the concept of adoption, how do you really paint the picture of what is too far with Teams? There must still be some guardrails of things that you would say, you can do this, but you should really stay away from doing this. Any advice there?
That's a great question. But before I answer that, you know what the next version of Windows is called?
Microsoft Teams.
Exactly, right? So as Chris has mentioned, it is an OS. I feel like Teams, and it's great. It's a business OS. So to your question, right? It's really exciting time. As Stephanie mentioned, you could do a lot in Teams. We haven't even talked about Dataverse and what you could do with Power Platform in Teams. But just like SharePoint, back in the day, I remember, and Chris would appreciate this, I was working with a customer. It's like, what I really need, or the Gantt chart in the project task list is not enough. I want to do dependencies. I want to do program level tracking for projects. Can we build that in SharePoint? I go, sure, but there's another product called Project Server that does that really well. Point being is, one thing you have to consider when you think about Teams as a platform, you can build a whole lot of stuff. Nothing's stopping you, right? From integrating things like Dataverse, where you could do your workflows and through Power Apps, build really cool stuff. But you also have to pause and think, it's not necessarily everything within Teams. And that's what I love about Teams. It has this whole ecosystem of apps, for example. You can bring in even non-Microsoft technology, right? And which is great. So for example, a lot of...
There's technologies at Microsoft. Tell me more.
Right. Like Jira, for example. We use Jira. A bunch of companies use Jira or ServiceNow, right? The beauty of this is, sure, you can replicate the functionality and rebuild it in Teams, but why, right? If you're already using it, bring it in. And that's the cool thing with Teams, is that better together story. In addition, and I kid you not, I was talking to a customer last week. They're like, is there a way where we can pull the data from our VAX VMS systems? For those who don't know what VAX VMS is, you weren't born yet at that time, and surface it in a list in SharePoint? I go, sure, you can, right? And maybe let's think about Teams as that front end. In short, the answer is, the guardrail is that before you think of rebuilding stuff in Teams, or unless it's a better way to do it, consider what you may have and just connect it and surface it in Teams and make Teams interact with it. Teams is that front end to get your work done.
Stephanie, you mentioned a couple of specific examples with the Q&A bot, an HR type specific thing. If you have one real example without exposing customer name, where the PAIT Group, heard the requirements and decided, yes, we're going to build you a custom X. Is there a first thing that comes to mind that paints a picture that, beyond getting started and staying within the guardrails, a real example that the PAIT Group has delivered?
There's plenty of examples of that. I think you can think as simple as, just applying branding. Sometimes you're building SharePoint framework, and that's a common request, right? Just getting something to make the site look really nice and to kind of give it more of that company theme. But then we kind of get into more complicated development sometimes, and sometimes that does include integrations and things like that. And one specific example, I know we do a ton of things in the Power Platform. I think right now that we're doing quite a bit of, and that's kind of due to this whole SharePoint Designer and SharePoint 2010 going away. And all of a sudden we have a bunch of people going, what are we going to do? Try to do a one for that. We're doing a lot of development in that space and kind of learning that space. We don't spend a lot of time in custom dev because the tools are there. We spend a lot more time in the Power Platform now to really create stuff.
In terms of the guardrails, not that you always need to stay within them, but I heard you say the SharePoint framework, which to me is sort of the newest SharePoint guardrail. If you can do it with SPFX, it's going to already keep you within a comfortable zone without going to true C#.NET crazy town. And also the Power Platform, it's really intended to write less code, but not to limit what you can accomplish. So those are great examples, and I think relevant in both what Dux was just saying and the approach that you take when you want people to have successful rollouts, successful implementation, actual use, but not something regret a year or two from now.
I may add one example because you're asking for about examples. So being a software company, we get a lot of feedback from customers. A customer came to us and they said, hey, one of the issues we're having with Microsoft 365 or Office 365 is when people delete stuff, email, Word document, chats, SharePoint sites, and they decide like 5 weeks later they want it back. They always have to fill a ticket request. Hey, I lost my email. Can you bring it back? Is there a way, or do you guys have anything that can help users self-service restore? And this has nothing to do with our existing products. And we're like, yeah, that's a cool idea. But how can we best do that to surface it to the broader end user? Because most of our interactions are with IT. One person, our development team's like, why don't we just create a bot and give it away for free, no strings attached? And that's what we did. So in the App Store, Teams App Store, there's a bot called Ava, AvePoint Virtual Assistant. And this bot will retrieve stuff that's been deleted as long as it's still within that, restore period from Microsoft 365. So instead of bugging IT, hey, can you get my email back? They can just talk to Ava. Hey, Ava, I need my email back, or I need my Word document back, or can you restore my SharePoint site? And it would do that self-service. So that was a low-hanging fruit because it's a win-win. IT doesn't have to be the bottleneck, and users are empowered to restore stuff that was deleted, where otherwise they have to wait for IT to do it for them.
It sounds like sweet-tasting, low-hanging fruit is how I would put it. And I will admit, you got me thinking about Wall-E. If your product is called Ava, say it with me, Ava.
Exactly.
Probably
that has something to do with that.
That's right. So before we go, wanted to get from you, both are really focused on helping customers at scale think about things right, get started, and then obviously get into a really nice run state. There's a lot just from using it, what does it do, rolling it out, getting people comfortable with it, the platform side of it and extending it. When you think of yourself as a user, whether it's like here today, what's a best practice? What's the thing that now that you've used it a lot, you've trained a ton of people, you've rolled it out. Start with Stephanie. What is the number one tip that you would tell somebody that is going to be diving into Teams?
Turn on noise suppression. It is my favorite thing. I was doing a podcast last week and of course, work from home. My husband's home in the kitchen right below my office turns on the blender. And it scared me. I almost jumped out of my chair and we stopped and I was like, did you guys hear that? They're like, nope. I'm like, haha. Yes. So noise suppression, that's my number one. And every time I tell customers, they're so excited about it. I love that feature.
Did you say it was a noisy husband suppression feature?
Yes. Also for children and animals.
Very good. All right. So noise suppression, Stephanie. Dux, what is your tip or trick?
Record your meetings. And the beauty of the recording is not necessarily that you have to watch it all day long, but just in case at some point you need to get to it and search it. I just love the transcription capability where you can look stuff up.
I like it. The value of once it's been recorded and what you can do with it is totally there.
That's a great
Chris, I've been on a couple of Teams meetings with you, and I've seen some of your tips and tricks, but what would be that one that you would share with our audience today, Chris?
Especially if you have recurring meetings in the same team, kind of close to what Dux was saying, set up a channel for meetings, because that makes it much easier for people to, within one contained area, roll back to see what the chat was, what the recording was from a week ago or a month ago. They're all there, they're all saved, and that's great, and they're searchable, but it's a little bit more user-friendly to keep everything in the same place so that when people are out of pocket, as many people are about to go out of pocket, activity can still continue, and it's easier to plug in asynchronously as you have the opportunity to do that. That's definitely one of the best practices that I've seen and one that I make use of. Mark, would love to get your thoughts on a tip, trick, best, or just pretty good practice.
So the decent practice, I will say, because you all had pretty good ones. For anything like this meeting where it's a broader, lots of people talking and it's meant to be recorded and there might be some chatter before and some chatter after, sometimes getting to the chat in the meeting is great. It's there on the right-hand side, but there's two things that I'm not a big fan of. It's really small, and so if you're only confined to type in that small area, they go by really quickly and it's sometimes hard to navigate. But now because we have the pop-out chat, I actually pin the chat for that meeting so that it's easy to get to. And then I can actually get it from my chat app in Teams, not just within the meeting itself. And so it's a little bit wider. It's like any other chat, and I can navigate chats while the meeting's going. And so I can do the meeting itself in a bigger screen and manage the chat just on a more dedicated space. So pinning meeting chats for access and a little bit ease of use. How do you think about whether it's specifically Teams templates or just taking a templatized approach for ensuring that some of those best practices are almost there by default? Like Chris had said, setting up a channel meeting or doing X tabs by default. How do you think about the importance of channel and maybe some of those things that you say proactively?
So we see that as being like the consistency there being super important when we're looking at rolling out things like project-based teams, where you have that consistent, repeatable process of I need to go in, I need to be able to find something like a contract for this project. I need to know kind of where things are at and how it's laid out and have that be a very predictable thing. That's where we're really pushing on more of the templates. And, we've got customers that kind of for years have been wanting to do this kind of thing and kind of started into that in SharePoint, but Teams has really taken hold as being kind of their primary place for collaborating around projects. And so we love that consistency. And that's really where we have focused a lot of time on as it relates to that.
Yeah, I agree. I think just having these templates provides guidance, especially for those people that are new to Teams. Instead of trying to figure out, what channels do I need? What tabs do I need to have? Just providing those templates. And frankly, I'm grateful for Microsoft even providing some starter templates, right? I just wish it was called Fantastic 40.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. You've said subsites and Fantastic 40 in one podcast. That's got to be a limit right there.
Right. Well, I got to talk about the GAC.
Now you're going to start talking about camel languages and all this crazy stuff. I do want to turn and hear from both Stephanie and Dux how people can keep up with both them and the PAIT Group and, of course, AvePoint. So starting with Stephanie, where can people go to either see your next offering at an event or follow you on Twitter or anything about the PAIT Group?
So you can find us at paitgroup.com. It's PAIT group.com. You can find me on Twitter, Steph K. Donahue.
Dux, same question. Where can people see what you're quacking about these days?
That's right. I got my ducks in a row. So meet Dux on all social platforms, LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram. You'll get all of me there. Because I was inspired by Mark and Chris, I have a podcast as well. It's called Shift Happens, where I talk to customers around their modern workplace journey. Shift with an F, okay? Shift Happens. It's in all of the podcast platforms. So again, thank you for having us today.
Again, thank you both for being on the intro zone.
Thank you.
Up next on the Intro Zone, we take a look at events. If there's something going on in the world with SharePoint, the intelligent intranet, Microsoft 365, Teams, or beyond, we want to bring it to you here on the Intro Zone. So first one up, coming on March 16th and 17th, Global Con 5, brought to you by the folks at Collab 365. So this is their fifth, as you might guess, virtual conference that they've had over the past year or so. They always manage to get a great selection of content and speakers. You can learn more about it through the link in the show notes.
So if you're still hanging on for more training after the mid-March point, there's a fun one that's coming up to celebrate SharePoint's 20th birthday. Our collaborative friends in the EU, the Collab Summit team, Addison Spence. This is on March 27th, 2021, and it's a day-long event that's going to kick off with Jeff Teeper, but a lot of great regional and time zone-based events throughout the day. We've got a couple of fun things planned, so look for some more content and, of course, a lot more voices around SharePoint's 20th birthday party.
And as we roll forward into the spring, we look forward to the AIM conference. The AIM conference will be virtual this year, but it is going to be a sci-fi, interplanetary, intergalactic themed event. But it is a great place for people who think about content and governance and workflow and all of the things that you can do in and around content, which is near and dear to SharePoint's heart. The AIM conference is a place for you. Microsoft is lead sponsor of the event, and we look forward to engaging with you there. If you would like to participate, just a little guidance, the AIM conference is not a Microsoft event. So it is great for us to go and talk to customers and potential customers from all over the world and talk to some of our partners and some of our future partners about their solutions. So a great place to kind of sample everything going on in the wide world of content with Microsoft and, of course, well beyond.
So the next few events that we have that we want to list out and call attention to are a couple that are ongoing. So there are multiple offerings. And the one that we want to talk about next is the SharePoint Fest virtual workshops. These continue now through and into March 2021. And as before, these are delivered by great trainers, both Microsoft and mostly by our MVPs, focused on SharePoint, OneDrive, Power BI. There's a lot of things focused around Power Apps and learning more about Teams and some of the automations with Power Automate. I have one session that I'll be driving on March 24th, focused on building content into your Microsoft Teams communication strategy, similar to what we're talking about on this episode with Dux and Stephanie, is really focused on how do you build content into your communications plan. But a lot of great workshops, easy to sign up, and a great resource if you want to get that deeper training.
Ongoing throughout the world, SharePoint Saturdays. There are every Saturday, people gathering virtually and hopefully in the not too distant future, back to doing in-person free events, community sponsored, community organized. It's a great place if you're just getting started with this community or with SharePoint or Microsoft 365 to connect, learn a little, introduce yourself, and get started. Just looking forward, there are events coming up in Chennai, Pune, Philadelphia, and there'll be even more to come as we get further into the year. You can learn more again at spsevents.org.
And similar to SharePoint Saturdays, sometimes taking a bit of a broader view across more products and services that they cover from a training perspective is the Collab Days. These are similar to SharePoint Saturdays in the context of how they're delivered. They're delivered more targeted at a region, but again, a broader set of content. Upcoming events are going to be in Bremen, March 19th to the 20th. And in April, there's one that's in the Nordics. And then later in this year in Cologne, Germany. Think of those as great ways from a regional perspective to get great content, great networking. And if you're familiar with SharePoint Saturdays, Collab Days is a very similar ongoing event offering. So lots of great material there to learn, and we'll put a link in the show notes.
And of course, if you have an event that you're connected to or sponsoring or just would like the world to know about, please write to us here at the IntraZone. We'll be sure to include it in a future broadcast where Mark promotes it, and I make a strange sports reference. We've wrapped yet another episode of the IntraZone. Thank you for spending your time with us. And of course, our guest this week, we'd like to thank Stephanie and Dux for sharing their crazy with us here on the IntraZone. And we'll add links to everything they talked about and more in the show notes.
You can always check out our show page at aka.ms/theintrazone to find all past shows and a lot more information per each show.
And if you're interested in discovering more Microsoft shows, visit aka.ms/Microsoft/podcasts or adoption.microsoft.com and discover a new program that you can take with you wherever you listen to your podcasts.
And you can always email us at theintrozone@microsoft.com or on Twitter, reach out to us at SharePoint, @mcashman, and @cmcnulty2000.
Word of mouth remains the best way people learn about podcasts. So if you've enjoyed this show, help us help others. Share that SharePoint love and subscribe at your local Super Bowl or wherever you get your podcasts.
We are your hosts, Mark Cashman and Chris McNulty, and you've been listening to The Introzone, a show about the Microsoft 365 Teams-powered intelligent intranet.